The comparison of Alcibiades with Coriolanus continues our exploration into Plutarch's Lives, translated by John Dryden, revised by Arthur Hugh Clough. Having described all their actions that seem to deserve commemoration, their military ones, we may say, incline the balance very decidedly upon neither side. They, both, in pretty equal measure, displayed, on numerous occasions, the daring and courage of the soldier, and the skill and foresight of the general, unless indeed the fact that Alcibiades was victorious and successful in many contests, both by sea and land, ought to gain him the title of a more complex commander, that so long as they remained and held command in their respective countries, they eminently sustained, and when they were driven into exile, yet more eminently damaged, the fortunes of those countries is common to both. All sober citizens felt disgust at the petulance, the low flattery, and the base seductions which Alcibiades in his public life allowed himself to employ with the view of winning the people's favor, and the ungraciousness, pride, and oligarchical haughtiness which Marcius, on the other hand, displayed in his were the abhorrence of the Roman populace. Neither of these courses can be called commendable, but a man who ingratiates himself by indulgence and flattery is hardly so censurable as one who, to avoid the appearance of flattering, insults. To seek power by servility to the people is a disgrace, but to maintain it by terror, violence, and oppression is not a disgrace only, but an injustice too. Marcius, according to our common conceptions of his character, was undoubtedly simple and straightforward, Alcibiades unscrupulous as a public man, and false. He is more especially blamed for the dishonorable and treacherous ways in which Thucydides relates he imposed upon Lacedaemonian ambassadors and disturbed the continuance of the peace. Yet this policy, which engaged the city again in war, nevertheless placed it in a powerful and formidable position. By the accession which Alcibiades obtained for it of the alliance of Argos and Mantinea, and Coriolanus also, and Dionysius relates, used unfair means to excite war between the Romans and the Volscians in the false report which he spread about the visitors at the games, and the motive of this action seems to make it the worst of the two, since it was not done like the other out of ordinary political jealousy, strife, and competition, simply to gratify anger from which, as Jan says, no one ever yet got any return. He threw the whole districts of Italy into confusion, and sacrificed to his passion against his country numerous innocent cities. It is true indeed that Alcibiades also by his resentment was the occasion of great disasters to his country, but he relented as soon as he found their feelings to be changed, and after he was driven out a second time, so far from taking pleasure in the errors and inadvertencies of their commanders, are being indifferent to the danger they were thus incurring, he did the very thing that Aristides is so highly commended for doing to Themistocles. He came to the generals who were his enemies, and pointed out to them what they ought to do. Coriolanus, on the other hand, first of all attacked the whole body of his countrymen, though only one portion of them had done him any wrong, while the other, the better and nobler portion, had actually suffered, as well as sympathized with him. And secondly, by the obduracy with which he resisted numerous embassies and supplications addressed in propitiation of his single anger and offense, he showed that it had been to destroy and overthrow, not to recover and regain his country, that he had excited bitter and implacable hostilities against it. There is, indeed, one distinction that may be drawn. Alcibiades, it may be said, was not safe among the Spartans, and had the inducements at once of fear and of hatred to lead him again to Athens, whereas Marcius could not honorably have left out Volscians when they were behaving so well to him. He, in the command of their forces and the enjoyment of their entire confidence, was in a very different position from Alcibiades, whom the Lacedaemonians did not so much wish to adopt into their service as to use and then abandon. Driven about from house to house in the city, and from the general to general in the camp, the latter had no resort but to place himself in the hands of Tissaphernes, unless indeed we are supposed that his object in courting favor with him was to avert the entire destruction of his native city, whither he wished himself to return. As regards money, Alcibiades, we are told, was often guilty of procuring it by accepting bribes, and spent it ill in luxury and dissipation. Coriolanus declined to receive it, even when pressed upon him by his commanders as an honor, and one great reason for the odium he incurred with the populace in the discussions about their debts was that he trampled upon the poor, not for money's sake, but out of pride and insolence. Antipater, in a letter written upon the death of Aristotle the philosopher, observes, amongst his other gifts he had that of persuasiveness, and absence of this in the character of Marcius made all his great action and noble qualities unacceptable to those whom they benefited. Pride and self-will, the consort, as Plato calls it, of solitude, made him insufferable. With the skill which Alcibiades, on the contrary, possessed, to treat every one in the way most agreeable to him, we cannot wonder that all his successes were attended with the most exuberant favor and honor, his very errors at times being accompanied by something of grace and felicity. So whether you make a mistake and, okay, I'm making a mistake, the attitude or the response to whether you succeed or fail is definitely something that tips the scales, isn't it? And so, in spite of great and frequent hurt that he had done the city, he was repeatedly appointed to office and command, while Coriolanus stood in vain for a place which his great services had made his due. The one, in spite of the harm he occasioned, could not make himself hated, nor the other, with all the admiration he attracted, succeeded in being beloved by his countrymen. Coriolanus, moreover, it should be said, did not, as a general, obtain any successes for his country, but only for his enemies against his country. Alcibiades was often of service to Athens, both as a soldier and as a commander. So long as he was personally present, he had a perfect mastery of his political adversaries. Calumny only succeeded in his absence. Coriolanus was condemned in person at Rome, and in like manner killed by the Volscians, not indeed with any right or justice, yet not without some pretext occasioned by his own acts. Since, after rejecting all conditions of peace in public, in private he yielded to the solicitations of the women, and, without establishing peace, threw up the favorable chances of war, he ought, before retiring, to have obtained the consent of those who had placed their trust in him. If indeed he considered their claims on him to be the strongest, or if we say that he did not care about the Volscians, but merely had prosecuted the war, which he now obtained, for the satisfaction of his own resentment, then the noble thing would have been not to spare his country for his mother's sake, but his mother in and with his country, since both his mother and his wife were part and parcel of that endangered country. After harshly repelling public supplications, the entreaties of ambassadors, and the prayers of priests, to concede all as a private favor to his mother was less an honor to her than a dishonor to the city, which thus escaped in spite, it would seem, of its own demerits through the intercession of a single woman. Such a grace could indeed seem merely invidious, ungracious, and unreasonable in the eyes of both parties. He retreated without listening to the persuasions of his opponents or asking the consent of his friends. The origin of all lay in his unsociable, supercilious, and self-willed disposition, which in all cases is offensive to most people, and when combined with a passion for the distinction passes into absolute savageness and mercilessness. Men decline to ask favors of the people, professing not to need any honors from them, and then are indignant if they do not obtain them. Metellus, Aristides, and Epaminondas certainly did not beg favors of the multitude, but that was because they, in real truth, did not value the gifts which a popular body can either confer or refuse, and when they were more than once driven into exile, rejected at elections, and condemned in courts of justice, they showed no resentment at the ill humor of their fellow citizens, but were willing and contented to return and be reconciled when the feeling altered and they were wished for. He who least likes courting favor ought also least to think of resenting neglect. To feel wounded at being refused a distinction can only arise from an overweening appetite to have it. Alcibiades never professed to deny that it was pleasant to him to be honored, and distasteful to him to be overlooked, and accordingly he always tried to place himself upon good terms with all that he met. Coriolanus's pride forbade him to pay attentions to those who could have promoted his advancement, and yet his love of distinction made him feel hurt and angry when he was disregarded. Such are the faulty parts of his character, which in all other respects was a noble one, for his temperance, continuance, and probity he claims to be compared with the best and purest of the Greeks, not in any sort or kind with Alcibiades, the least scrupulous and most entirely careless of human beings in all these points. Now, no one's in anybody else's situation, and you don't know what it's like for them, but you can say, well, what did they have to work with, and how did they work it? You can say, well, this person was wrong in this situation and right in this situation, and whatever degree of good or evil in whatever situation, that's one thing. But yeah, comparing people of different times, it seems the Greeks didn't have this sort of level of example that you would expect from like the prophets. So they look to all these heroes which are flawed, and so you look at the good qualities of this hero and the good qualities of that hero, but don't excuse yourself because, well, they had bad qualities too.